week. I thought that was a great initiative and particularly, what leaders can do, in these times when people are self-isolating, and how you can still be a great leader. So asked Mary to perhaps speak to that. So she's expanded a bit beyond that, which is fantastic. So without sort of further ado, I'll hand over to Mary, and really look forward to your hints and tips in these times.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. I just need to be very clear, technology is not my friend. It has never been my friend, so I'm going to do my very best. I'm going to try and share a screen and put up a presentation and see how we go. So can people see that? Fantastic, head's shaking, that's awesome, great. So, good morning. I guess with this being the first day of our country's shutdown, the topic of today's webinar and audience discussion is clearly really timely and relevant. And so what we're looking at is in today's, let me just get this going. So, topic and question for today: how can the field of organisational psychology practically support organisations to cope during this unprecedented time of turbulence and uncertainty? Certainly the first of its kind in kind of modern time with our modern type organisations. How can we help? I think the first thing to know for this presentation is, if I'm really honest, it's not the most well thought out or constructed webinar, as it was put together very quickly amongst the craziness of the last couple of days. So bear with me. Hopefully though, some of the content will provoke some thinking and discussion on how we can practically support our organisations across New Zealand. I thought in speaking to this really topical question today, it would make sense for me, with my background, which is very practically applied. I spent 30 years in the private sector in the industry. So I thought it would make sense for me to take the perspective of past roles of mine, that of HR director, GM of HR and so forth. And knowing what I know, how I could perceive the practical ways in which IO psychology professionals might be able to support the really overwhelming challenges that past CEOs of mine and executive cohorts are probably dealing with in this particular climate. While today we're going to focus on 3 organisational areas: remote working, downsizing and restructuring, and pushing the reset button when the worst is over, there are obviously many other organisational issues that could and should absolutely be discussed by this really important IO psychology audience. The purpose of these further virtual discussions and brainstorming sessions by this audience would of course be for our field to play a really proactive collective role in New Zealand organisations and helping them with these rapidly changing challenges. But more than that, and this is one of the key reasons that I jumped at the opportunity when John reached out to me, more than that, I firmly believe that as a virtual community, IO psychologists and IO psychology industry professionals throughout New Zealand, if we can all come together when the time is right and the worst is over, we can play a really essential role collectively in expediting the recovery of our economy. So more on this particular line of thought. For now, let's get into it. So today, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to look at the topic of remote working, as well as downsizing and restructuring, pushing that reset and button. Once the presentation is finished, it'll be followed by a Q&A session, theoretical questions. I will be handing over to John Eatwell, the rest of you to answer. Plus, we're looking to have a discussion around the possibility of forming a task force to support our organisations, but we'll come to that later. and again, that task force is looking to help New Zealand organisations that really are struggling to cope with the turbulence of this unprecedented situation. So, what I'm starting with today, is a focus in the world of remote working on virtual management techniques. Now, these are techniques that I've worked in global organisations for many years, and as a consequence have been engaged in the use of virtual management techniques for many, many years. And so I know that they can definitely support successful remote working from home. As John mentioned, I wrote an article last week that was related to virtual management leadership. I'm not sure whether John got a chance to send it out or whether you were able to read that article. But what I'm going to do is just take some time to reiterate the content of this particular article. So starting with a key issue for humans when considering remote working in isolation. We all know, this audience knows, that humans really are hardwired to be a social species. We absolutely survive and thrive better together until, of course, we don't, which is unfortunately the case with COVID-19. Self-isolated remote working is obviously really counterintuitive. Long-term, it's counterintuitive to the need for group contact. So the question becomes, how can we retain a sense of community in this new virtual world? So first of all, let's just look at some of the issues that we know exist with virtual management. I made this point in the article that a really practical point, a starting point and strong platform for dealing with issues was virtual management. So virtual management, of course, being defined as the supervision, leadership and maintenance of virtual teams, dispersed work teams that really, if ever, meet face to face. So, and as I said, they've been used successfully for many years. But first of all, let's have a look at what some of the issues are with virtual management. So, misunderstanding from poor communication and incompatible communication preferences. We all know exactly what happens when you put a radical introvert and a radical extrovert in the same conversation without these people having any understanding of what the preferences mean or what their preferences mean from a communication standpoint. So when you're doing that virtually, the issues that can happen from incompatible communication preferences are quite significant. We've also got differences in work ethic and that ability to self-manage, the autonomy, which has always been one of the issues with self-management teams. Lack of clarity and direction and frequent second guessing. So in the world of strategy execution, when you are trying to execute on strategy or you're trying to communicate prioritization, that's one of the most difficult things to do for organizations, is to get that communication right. We have schemas where we interpret text very differently. We know that if we look at a particular page of text, we, because of our own schemas, are going to interpret that text differently. So in the world of remote working, getting clarity and direction right is a really difficult thing to do. There's that deficient sense of ownership and commitment when you don't have that face-to-face contact on a day-to-day basis. There can be an inability to ask the right questions. Again, that virtual distancing can make it difficult for people when trying to seek clarity, having the ability to ask the right questions. And then leaders and employees' difficulty with the delegation. Not getting that clarity and not having that ability to be able to ask the right questions. So, in the article, the article that I released last week, I talked about some of the techniques that are strong for looking at successful remote working. And the first thing I started with was around communication. The point I made in this particular part of the article was that if you are a leader in an organization, your job now becomes daily clarity, making sure that you are touching base with your people on a daily basis. Start the working week with a virtual meeting to start talking about what's going to happen this week. So communication, 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 helping with that sense of connectiveness and that sense of belonging, and giving people the ability to ask questions, any questions. So communication, communication, communication where possible. The second point I made was around, again, making sure, even if you think your people are really clear on their prioritization, prioritized work, taking the opportunity to do that, any opportunity that you have, setting those clear work prioritizations and making sure that people are clear on the delegated work. Those organizations that are currently in the world of Agile Scrum are 10 steps ahead of everyone else because they're used to this. They're used to the ability to understand prioritized work. They generally work in 3 or 4 week scrums. And so they've already got that knowledge way ahead. And of course, in the world of software today, there are some very clever, cunning tools to help with Agile methodology. But of course, there are many organizations that aren't set up that way. The point I made here is tough conversations are okay and may be required. Unfortunately, in times of instability and uncertainty, we know that there is, albeit a very small percentage of people, but we do know that there are people that will be mischievous, will be stupid, and do silly things and just bring more turbulence, unnecessary turbulence to the situation. So the point I've made here to leaders out there is tough conversations are okay. I gave an example in the article of if you're seeing team members sending out blame game type emails to either individuals or other teams, that this is the type of thing that can add, again, undue stress in a situation that is already very stressful. So if they're seeing employees that are normally quite professional in their behaviour, acting this way, it's obviously a really good sign that they're not coping that well. If, however, they're seeing, and so they may need additional types of support, whether that's EAP, virtual support, or other forms of counselling, then that's a situation that they need to deal with fairly quickly. If they're seeing employees that have behaved in a mischievous way in past, or in a misconduct type of way in past, it is incredibly important they get onto that very quickly and just have a cut it out type of conversation. The type of distraction that can come from this inappropriate behaviour is clearly amplified in a remote working type situation. And living consciously was the last point I made in this article, and that living consciously meaning that, you know, doing everything possible to live consciously and make sure that negative emotions, dysfunctional emotions, are not ruling people's the reality of what's going on in that situation, and trying to manage that stress. Within that particular area and talking about living consciously, I gave a couple of really simple examples. Of what leaders could do immediately with their teams to help people live consciously and manage that stress. One of them was based on Stephen Covey's circle of influence and control. So I suggested that the leader get the team in the room, or virtually, if they were already in the world of remote working, and have each team member individually write down their own list of what was concerning them. And then they were to take a very big red pen and put a line through anything, or any one of those concerns that they simply did not have control over. Once they had done that, they were to take the items that were left, the ones that they had influence and control over, and take the 3 items that were having the greatest impact on them and put an action to each one of those to address those concerning issues. The other exercise I suggested, which again was a very practical exercise, was actually just getting the leader to hold a brainstorming session with their team and to identify things to come up with things that were concerning them about being in the world of remote working, whether that was lack of connectivity, feeling alone, worried about the future of the organisation, so that the leader could really help the team front foot and discuss their fears openly and come up with possible ideas and solutions. You know, and it might include ways to be much more virtually connected and to support team members that do have lower levels of resilience or are more prone to anxiety and depression and higher levels of stress. So for example, I suggested a virtual buddy system where one team member checks in daily on another team member, not to talk about work or anything like that, but to just actually have a conversation about how their day is going, how they're feeling, and so forth. So I wanted to make this point from that article. Probably the most prominent feedback theme I received to the release of the article from both our clients at the company that I work at, and also other organisational leaders that I've never met, including leaders around the globe. What really they appreciated within the article was that rather than just providing high-level tips and knowledge, that I also provided practical, easy to understand instructions on how to run those couple of sessions with the individuals and teams to help cope with the stress and anxiety of remote working. And I have to say, this is exactly why I took time out last week to write that article. At the time, we were getting seriously drowned via social media on COVID-19 facts dressed up as tips. And this, according to many of our clients, was just surprisingly unhelpful. What these people were really seeking was practical, simple to understand and easy to implement techniques to help them cope with organisational challenges that they felt and still feel that they were totally unprepared for in working in remote working. So I want you to keep that piece of feedback front and centre regarding the practical, simple to understand and easy to implement solutions and techniques for our discussion later today. So remote working. How do I see potentially org psychology helping? So some questions to think about. Are there more simple practical tools out there to help leaders communicate more effectively in the virtual world? Are there simple practical tools to help leaders virtually spot and deal with team individual conflict, anxiety, and stress? What more can leaders do to ensure meaningfulness of work? And what can leaders do to ensure team morale, engagement, and a strong sense of connected community? I was watching a clinical psychologist speak on Q&A on Sunday, and he made a really important point, and which I think we'll all agree, quite frankly, given examples from history, that we'll probably agree with his point as well, that at the moment there is a really determined sense of strong community feel and nervous excitement in a way about the novelty of shutdown and remote working. However, as he rightly pointed out, we really haven't been tested yet. Not really. And it's fairly recent. Even if we think about the earthquakes, while it was a tough time, we had the rest of New Zealand that was in a stable, certain situation being able to reach out and support us. And of course, that's not the case at the moment with the entire globe in this situation. So to his point, we really haven't been tested, and it's fairly reasonable to expect that if the shutdown is longer than 4 weeks, more like 2, 3, 4 months, as time goes by and the novelty wears off, the big question becomes just how long our happy little community remains a caring, kind, and tolerant community. And it is a big question. In the world of remote working, global organisations that have been practicing virtual management for many years are still refining and struggling to make the approach seamless. Often the remoteness over time, and I've seen this over and over in my global industry experience, often the remoteness over time creates untenable issues of well-being and mental health for employees, and as a clear result, affects clearly, as I said, the mental health, but also the productivity for the organisation. So this is one of the reasons that I strongly believe the world of IO psychology has a great deal to contribute in reducing the increasing risk of spending cumulative time in remote working and isolation. I think this is particularly true for New Zealand organisations that have never worked in a remote way and have little understanding of and knowledge of this working approach over time, and given also how quickly we escalated to level 4, these organisations had little time to prepare. So those questions that are up on the board are things that I think that this community can think about. As I said before, those organisations that are in the world of Agile Scrum methodology are probably in a lot stronger position than other organisations, but maybe there's other methodology out there as well that we can consider. But again, I think in this world, given how overwhelmed leaders are in trying to survive in this climate, the types of things that can be suggested will have to be simple and will have to be easy to implement. So let's move on to what is unfortunately an inevitable outcome of the current situation, the downsizing and restructuring of many New Zealand organisations. We know already for many organisations or industries, hospitality, tourism, travel, even a week in their world and shutdown is devastating from a financial loss perspective. There is just simply not the cash flow to survive for long periods of time. And while wage subsidy will clearly help organisations like restaurants and bars, wage cost is only one of many costs that need to be considered in the cost base of an organisation. So it is really clear that as a result of the shutdown, many organisations and businesses will struggle to survive. We know that tough decisions are going to have to be made. And the result for many organisations may be absolutely catastrophic. Employment relation processes will have to be virtually entered into for restructures and downsizing. So let's just go through what a normal change consultation process would include in a situation where downsizing or restructuring is going to have to be undertaken. Normally, we start with face-to-face consultation meetings to provide that proposal clarity. Because this is one of the hardest things to do, is to provide that proposal clarity. People's adrenaline is going through the roof. They've been summoned to a meeting. They don't know what's going on. The stress is huge. Getting that clarity is really difficult to do. So when we're holding consultations, we come down to 3 or 4 clear points in that business justification. So making sure that people are really clear about the business justification for the proposed change. There are details of the proposed outline changes that we're going through. We're discussing what will happen if the proposal takes place. We give timeframes for consultation, feedback and decisions making. In the shutdown world, all of those meetings will need to be virtual without any of the typical face-to-face levels of employment relations, good faith, duty of care type support. So, a restructure process in New Zealand today that is conducted in person is, as we all know, an extremely difficult process to get completely right. And at the moment, for any organisation to attempt to not cause any undue stress while downsizing because of the COVID-19 impact, well, this is clearly going to prove incredibly challenging with a whole new level of pain in our virtual world. So, restructure process. We know, well, we're fairly certain that the virtual process issues could include those communication misunderstandings, difficulty with proposal clarity. Even when you're in face-to-face, you know, you've got the opportunity for people to sit, you can take your time, you can allow the space that's required for people to ask questions to get that clarity and to understand it. We know that's going to be difficult in a virtual world. There'll be frustration with remote IT issues. You'll be potentially halfway through a consultation meeting and something will happen from an IT perspective. This will add to the confusion and to the anxiety. Not everyone has the luxury of well-connected Wi-Fi. So this will add to the confusion and the anxiety. Potentially, of course, there's that inability to support employees face-to-face. Even when you finish the consultation meeting, you always, as leaders, have the open door policy. Come and see me. And in an office, that's a 30-second thing to do. So we don't have that open door policy during this time. The time frames, a week in a virtual world will seem like 6 months in a virtual world. Time frames, even when you're doing it in a typical situation, given our employment law and what the time that we have to take with time frames, that will amplify the stress. On top of that, even when you are successfully communicating with an employee face-to-face about the business justification, we know that when they go home and they speak to their wife or their husband, Mama Bear comes out or Papa Bear comes out. And so that adds to the anxiety and stress of somebody going through that situation. How dare they do that to you? You've given 10 years of your life. What a bunch of bastards. That will become amplified in the world of virtual management. We know that that will create more stress. And again, without the open door policy and easy access, it will be amplified. Feedback will probably be messy because people are already overwhelmed in this world, particularly when, as I previously said, the novelty of shutdown and being in a remote world wears off. So that feedback potentially will be quite messy through distorted and overwhelmed thinking. I am particularly concerned about leaders' resilience and their ability to have to bring down the axe and deliver those tough decisions via virtual channel. When I've run, and I've unfortunately had to run many restructures over my 30 years in the industry, when I have been in that world, I have absolutely made sure that in 3 or 4 offices around the organisation, we have had EAP specialists or outplacement specialists, or for those people that potentially are going to not cope that well, more proficient, skilled counsellors sitting in the room. That's not going to be the same opportunity to be able to do that in this virtual world. So I am particularly worried about leaders' resilience to be able to deliver those tough decisions. So the question I have is, and I really want this audience, I think this audience potentially can help with this situation and are in the best position to be able to do so, is how can IO site practices effectively support reducing the above issues and risks? So this, if there is appetite to form a task force, I see this as almost one of the first cabs off the rank, is getting together and discussing this, defining what the problem statement is. We'll come to this later. So, in the restructuring, downsizing side of things, of course there will be those people that are staying and there will be those people that are leaving. So how can organisational psych help? We all know that far too often survivors of restructures are just simply ignored and just left to get on with it. They're ignored because of the prevailing view by management that survivors have a job, so they'll be fine. We also know that often this isn't the case and that survivors aren't fine, but are in fact suffering from anxiety, guilt and anger from watching their teammates that they've worked next to for many years, potentially, lose their jobs and their livelihood. So I think that while in this unprecedented situation in modern business times, it's a pretty safe bet to state that for survivors, those feelings of anxiety, guilt and anger will be amplified via their self-isolated situation. Given that their teammates have lost their jobs and probably have little to no chance of securing another role anytime soon in the future. So how can OrgPsych help? And we'll talk about how you do this stuff later, but ensure that there's organisational leader insight into survivor syndrome. Get that information out there. Provide leaders with simple practical tools to be able to deal with the survivor syndrome issues. Provide simple practical tools for employees to understand and deal with symptoms of survivor syndrome: guilt, anger, mistrust. Think about ways, because again, this is a survival thing. It's not a proactive business model change where there's plenty of time to think about the organizational redesign. For many organizations, this is a stop the bleeding crisis reactive move. And so are there ways that organizations can redesign team and individual workload to avoid and minimize the employee disgruntlement that will set in as soon as a person realizes that they may have a job, but they're now doing 3 jobs? So are there ways, because we just don't have the time or the maturity or sophistication in organizations at the moment, because they're clawing for survival, to think about this smartly? Are there ways to reduce complexity out of organizational design? And ways and tools to help leaders provide clarity if they have to go into a downsizing and they have to redesign, how they provide clarity on that future direction of the key prioritized workload. And again, this will be quite difficult to do because they're in uncertain times. This is being thrust upon them. So let's talk about those leaving. This is probably the area that I have the most concern in. Technology, okay. So for those people that are going to be leaving the organisation, we know that it's clear what the purpose of outplacement is, and that it's to support people that have lost their jobs via a restructure. The outplacement process helps those ex-employees through the brick wall so that they can find their new path and work direction, to quickly restore that individual meaning and self-worth. So a big, hairy question at the moment is, how does this happen in the current world where things have simply turned upside down? In the COVID-19 shutdown environment, how will a freshly developed CV and finely tuned interview skills help a newly unemployed person to cope with the trauma and the uncertainty of unemployment when there is little to no growth in our economy, with most people hunkering down, resulting in little to no turnover? The realistic answer, unfortunately, is it probably isn't going to help. So, with this sad reality in mind, we then turn our attention to another really tragic reality that we're all aware of, which is that the state of our New Zealand mental health is at crisis breaking point already, with nowhere near enough resource to deal with the overwhelming challenges that existed prior to COVID-19. And yet we find ourselves in a really gnarly, devastating, unthinkable situation, that through the COVID-19 shutdown control measures that will enable strong protection of one vulnerable sector of our community, we will inadvertently increase the number of people into another vulnerable sector of our community, a sector of people that are prone to depression and abnormal levels of stress and anxiety. Again, the sad reality is that many of these people, due to the large number of organisations that will need to downsize, are soon going to find themselves without a job, with little chance of finding another role anytime soon. On top of this, rather than have the ability to employ normal face-to-face outplacement support mechanisms to alleviate those feelings of desperation, loneliness, and helplessness for people that are prone to depression and anxiety, we are literally going to send thousands of people into a self-isolated state for an undefined period of time. This all in a country where, as previously mentioned, the state of our mental health systems are already at breaking point. We're in crisis and under-resourced, and as a result, we have one of the highest rates of suicide in the developed world. It is truly frightening to think about what this rate could look like year to date. So, how can organisational psychology help? I think we need to understand the problem statement clearly. As I've said, normal outplacement processes do not apply. And we're in a situation where there'll be either no growth or negative growth and little to no turnover. So, how do we understand clearly that problem statement? Is there an opportunity to join with our clinical psych brothers and sisters, other CEOs, Chamber of Commerce, HR, seasoned recruiters, and other relevant parties to work out new virtual outplacement and remote support processes so that our vulnerable people don't fall through the gap? How can we as a community help with this massive societal dilemma? One of the things, again, that if a task force is to be formed, again, I see this needing urgent, immediate attention, and again, as one of the first cabs of the rank, if a task force is to be put together. Okay, so let's talk about moving on to the final topic of pushing the reset button when the worst is over and we are trying to navigate our way back to normality. So let's start with looking at potentially some of the issues that we'll be facing with pushing that reset button. We know that the economy is going to be fragile with big industry gaps. There'll be potentially messy, disconnected organisations through the reactive need to survive and downsize and restructure. There will be a lack of clarity on what the core purpose is and the direction, resulting in that lack of meaningful work. Time is going to be required to design, rebuild, and create the new normal for our organisations. So, pushing the reset button. The reset solution issues might include, I'm sorry, I've got somebody standing behind me. I think it's my husband. Just, do you need something? No, okay, all right. He was just being nosy. There we go. So some of the reset solution issues might include establishing clear core ideology and envision future for clarity. So I work in the world of organisational culture or workplace culture at that organisational level. We work in very strategic ways. Often when I'm working with organisations, I find that there is a lacking in the core understanding of core ideology and envision future for the organisation. And quite frankly, we can't do our job unless this is clear, because workplace culture isn't for its own sake. It's there for a very specific reason. It's there to ensure that there is a fit for purpose organisation that can deploy or bring to life anything that the organisation is trying to do. So a lot of the work that I actually do is with boards, and I work with executive teams to do just this. And I will do this, and sigmoid curve sigmoid curve. So 4 stages to sigmoid curve: the inception of the business, growth of the business, a plateau to the business, and a decline of the business. Regardless of where an organisation is that we're partnering with, I will go through a process and to establish that core ideology and the vision future. This is not a difficult process. You do not have to be a KPMG, Deloitte's strategy consultant. Anyone can do this particular process. It is a case of sitting down with the exec team or the business owner or the board and going through a process of getting them to define what and why they exist and coming up with a really concise statement around that. So what is it that the organisation does and why do they do it? Even more importantly, because of course we know that the why is the intrinsic motivation that aligns our people across the organisation. Clarity around what is important, but it's the why that's really important from an intrinsic motivation perspective. Now, before I do this piece of work, I know that if I take those 6 executives and I put them in separate rooms and I put them through this exercise separately, I'm going to come up with 6 different core purpose statements. So that's the reason to get an exec team or a board or a business owner in a room and go through this process. There's also the opportunity to think about the aspired future and where the business needs to go. Often we also see organisations create incredibly complex strategies that are never going to go anywhere. We know 85% of organisations fail to deploy on strategy. One of the key reasons is the complexity of their strategy. Another key reason is because there's no core ideology and envision future statements that actually support that strategy and align to that strategy. So this is a really simple process, which again, as part of the task force, I'm more than happy to support the IO world to understand how we do that process. It's a really simple process and you can do it in a day. So I think establishing clear core ideology and envision future just puts people on it. It's a nice start, it's future focused, it's leaving the history behind, and it's putting the organisation on a good future focused step right off the bat. So great thing to do. Creating appropriate organisational design on the above. Of course, thinking about where they want to go and taking the opportunity, because they've not had the opportunity in this reactive world to think cleverly and intelligently about the design that's simply reacted. Take the opportunity to do this, get the appropriate organisational design, and then ramping up the required resource to support what a new org structure would look like in line with the ideology, the envision future, and the design. Re-establishing quickly mature leadership capability. And when I'm talking about leadership capability, I'm not talking about individual leadership skill set. That can come later. I'm talking about actually the consistent leadership language, expectations and behaviours of all leaders across the organisation, so that there is that consistent approach and it's a quickly expedited to be able to then establish norms and value behaviours and productivity performance. So maturing that leadership capability will go a long way to helping push that reset button. Dealing with the new wave of what I suspect will be survivor syndrome. One thing dealing with it virtually, but when people come back into the working environment, it's going to be potentially a very different world with them, a very sad world for them. So dealing with that new wave of survivor syndrome when they come back into the office and Jane is missing or John is missing, how to deal with that particular situation. So again, org psych help, providing practical guidance, tools and support to be able to accelerate, because that's what I'm talking about here, is not, this will happen through normal evolution, of course it will, but our economy is going to be fragile. So this is a key audience that has a strong level of skill set, knowledge and ability to be able to think about what are the practical tools and support that we can use to accelerate dealing with the above issues for organisations. So that's it. Really now, handing over to Q&A, any questions on the content, plus looking at then a discussion. And so the discussion being all around whether there is an appetite to form an IO Psych task force. So looking at the task force, proactively supporting New Zealand organisations with their challenging issues, that remote working, downsizing. So that's currently the stuff that's going on at the moment. So the purpose of the task force potentially would be to minimise that risk and damage to the ability of our organisations to be connective and productive in the current shutdown, as well as playing that key collective role in expediting the recovery of our economy. The what of it all, exploring, designing and delivering different strategies with practical and easy to implement techniques, tools and processes. Because remember, in this world, organisations aren't going to be in a mature, sophisticated state. The vulnerable organisations are not. The ones that are struggling with challenges at the moment are not. They're going to be overwhelmed. So the things that this task force look at will need to be fairly practical and fairly easy to implement techniques, tools and processes. The how, well, that's what the discussion is really all about if there is an appetite. I put down a thought pattern around it. It may be that there is a national task force, 1240 members, that after defining well-informed problem statements, and when I mean well-informed problem statements, I mean that the task force works with CEOs and boards and business owners to really strongly understand what their rapidly changing challenges are, what they're facing and so forth in this unprecedented world. So after defining those well-informed problem statements, then designing the practical, simple and quick to implement strategies, techniques, etc., potentially using social media platforms to deliver content and information related to all of the strategies and techniques. Alternatively, it may make sense to, once we understand what the problem statements are, design on a regional basis, or have that national task force that then cascades outwards what the problems are to different regions, so that teams within those regions can work together to sort out what the problems are. Or it might be a combination of both approaches. And of course, time and contribution to the task force would be in the spirit of giving. However, an action, I believe, any action taken by this task force would most likely lift the profile of organisational psychology in New Zealand organisations. So, yay, yay. So really that's me. I've done a lot of talking. I'm now going to hand over Q&A. As I've said, if it's around organisations and practical stuff, happy to answer any questions if you've got any of me, but we've also got some other wonderful people and it's more of an open discussion from that perspective. So John, I might just hand over to you to lead that Q&A session before we get into the discussion.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Yeah, so I guess any questions at this stage? I think if you unshare your screen, Mary, then we'll be able to see people. I think is that the way it works, Rosie? Oh, there you go. Yep.
Look at me.
Sort of a gallery view. Fantastic.
There we go.
So, I think you can raise your hand if you've got a question, or just unmute. Or should we raise your hand for a start and see we've got? Oh, Joanna. Unmute.
Thank you, Mary. And I think this is a great idea. It's timely. And you laid out a lot of the strategic aims of what this task force could accomplish. And I guess now the ball is in our court to come up with one of the thoughts, well, several thoughts, and then I wrote a few down, if I may, but just some overarching thoughts. Underlying that strategy, we might need a couple of things. One of them is to follow the informational step. one of the things that I found working with organizations in disaster recovery post-quake was that people really appreciated understanding what was happening to them. So even having a bit of an informational session or little clips on stress and what stress does to the body and mind, and how that spills over to work behaviors or how we act to others outside of work. People found that in recovery trajectories, people found that really useful. It normalized how they were feeling, what they were experiencing. And as a result of that, they were then better able to engage with the work-oriented strategies. So that informational step could cover things like stress, meaning of work, so what accounts for, what might explain meaning of work, our cognitive ability when we're experiencing a high stress situation or facing social isolation. So again, the idea is to provide some rationale and to normalize people's responses to what's happening. And then following that informational step, then the operational step. And for Mary's presentation, I kept coming back to the idea of job crafting. It's almost like we have to fast forward the natural progression of how work and organizations will be designed, and far more relying on technology. So instead of waiting another 20 to 30 years, we might have to accelerate that process to a point where people will have to work remotely and lead remotely far more than we do now, but very suddenly. And the other thing is about reinventing work. So staying relevant in an organization might be one way of avoiding the dreaded downsizing or being quickly taken up by another organization. Say, well, what is my skill set? How could I? An example of this is I have a good friend that works in Australia, and following the bushfires, this is really not helping the tourist industry. And she works at a winery. They organize a bunch of events, weddings. And so they were already in the red following the bushfires. And now they're looking to downsize people. And the first thing I told her is, look, you're really good with computers, with marketing, with reaching out to people. So you need to quickly reinvent yourself, and you have a really good relationship with your boss. Just offer your services as someone who can revamp the online marketing and online services that that organization can provide. So it's about flagging to people that they can reposition themselves and rely on, transfer their skill set toward job crafting. So there are a bunch of things I think we could do in bite-size, friendly, simple ways in which we could perhaps provide some, not just information, but practical suggestions to organizations in this is beyond recovery, it's reinvention process, really. That was my 2 cents.
Yeah, it's good 2 cents. Just conscious of time, so should we have a couple of minutes if there's any particular questions of Mary, and then perhaps have the last few minutes on potential task force or who's interested. Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, John. Hey, Mary, great presentation. For someone who gave the impression at the start you threw it together, there was some fantastic content, so thank you very much for that. Yeah, I do have a question. I've got a couple of comments. I mean, one of the comments too, if we think about that, most of us tend to have clients in the large corporate sector. Not many of us have clients in the small business workspace who don't just have the budgets for our advice necessarily, or may not even have an HR person. And so for a lot of these individuals, they may be going through a very different, or they'll be going through the very similar stuff. But you'll have a lot of small businesses will make very early decisions. They'll be very nimble, or they'll kind of hang on. They'll hang on for that wage subsidy because they want to hang on to their staff. They won't want to replace them. So it's going to be quite fluid for some time. And I think, as you alluded to before, it's still very early days, and we have to listen to the narrative, listen to the needs that are coming out. One question I've got for you, Mary, has there been a conversation at the ministerial level regarding a task force? Because a number of the individuals and roles you were talking about in that group, which is a great idea, are at a certain level. That has there been contact or support at a ministerial level for creating something? Because now is a great time to get a group together and start that korero about putting some resources or some thinking in place that might help their recovery process?
I have no idea whether there's been conversation. I would suggest that that it would be received gratefully, I suspect, given that, to my point, the Organisational Psychology Institute and members, and also IO industry professionals out there, are just so primed to be able to think through and support the smaller and medium. That's really what I was thinking of from that perspective when I'm thinking about this task force, because a lot of our clients are in that small, medium size, and were just in such a spin last week, absolute spin, and are just totally overwhelmed by the situation. Yeah. And I think that goes to my point around the larger corporates. I still think there is a place to support larger corporates, and particularly when I talk about the outplacement side of things. I mean, we tend to do that really well in this country, and we have good processes around it, but it's about getting the person over the brick wall. When there's nothing on the other side of that brick wall, you know, I heard them talking about going and picking kiwi fruit. Well, that's very nice, but nobody can actually get to the kiwi fruit orchards because nobody's allowed to move. So in that particular situation, you know, that's really where I'm worried about. And of course, we are proactively protecting one vulnerable sector. I have an 80-year-old mother. My husband is vulnerable because of a pre-existing medical, so I'm all for that, absolutely. But I know there are clinical people that have been sort of raising, well, they have been raising the issue about the mental health side of things, but I don't think there is enough conversation and narrative going on at the moment around sending these people into isolation. I don't think enough of that conversation is going on at the moment. And I think we're in a prime position to be able to work with ministry, work with government, and put that task force together. So I think it would, I don't know whether a conversation's already happened, I have no idea, but I would suggest that potentially John and the other regional leaders of the Institute reach out to their networks within and start having that conversation and working that one out. It's a case of actually working out what is the purpose, what does it look like, what can it offer, what are the key responsibilities of this task force, and then potentially, once we've got that as an understanding, reaching out to maybe MB or other ministries that potentially are relevant stakeholders to speak with.
Fantastic. I'm just conscious of the time. So I think I can't imagine anybody not thinking this is a good idea. So what I'm suggesting is that I email everybody, and I think there's 3 potential working groups, isn't there? From my thought, there's one on virtual leadership and supporting virtual working. Second one is sort of change management in a virtual world, and the third one is potentially pushing the reset button. How do we do that effectively? So what I'll do is I'll send out an email to everybody there and say, are you interested in belonging to or working in one of those groups, and then setting up some using this discussion forum to actually start setting up some groups to action plan those, and as Mary says, statement of work or statement of the problem, and coming up with the terms of reference. And obviously the first 2 groups is a bit of pressure on to get a result out, and at the very least we can share that result with the people on this group or the Institute or IONet or whatever else it is, so that we can actually start getting some better support out there. Does that sound like an action plan? Yep, thumb up if it's good.
Yeah. It will definitely, John, it'll definitely be important, as I say, when defining the problem statements, because it is so rapidly changing that in doing that, whichever group is working on whatever issue, the input is definitely coming in from both potentially CEOs in private and public sector. But I can talk about that with you offline.
Fantastic. Well, I'll just I'd like to take the opportunity of thanking Mary for again, putting together a very comprehensive presentation at short notice, and I think and issuing us with a fantastic challenge for what we can do going forward, and how we can coordinate our activities and help New Zealand in this and New Zealanders in this critical time. So thank you very much.
Thanks everyone.
Thank
Be
you.
safe.